But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss how leaders and their decisions shape the world we live in today.
Welcome to episode 7 of the History in Motion podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Honest Abe, or Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. We start with his background and his meteoric rise to the White House, and ultimately we look at his decision to not execute Confederate leadership. Considering the carnage and massive loss of life that resulted from the Civil War, we must ask ourselves what propelled Lincoln to pursue a more diplomatic, less violent approach. Listen in as we discuss Lincoln's decision and try to better understand what his rationale was and the broader factors at play that Lincoln had to contend with. So without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of the History in Motion podcast. And today I think we're going through one of the most written about, talked about, studied men and pieces of history that has ever existed. So that's Abraham Lincoln and his decision to pardon Confederate leaders after the Civil War. So I think, Ritchie, we talked about this, right, on just how heavily studied this topic is and how deep it goes. So we've kind of made the natural decision of we're going to kind of skip over kind of what happens during the war and really focus on who Lincoln is as a person, kind of the pretext to the Civil War, and then kind of focus more on that decision itself, because I think we'd be here till next week if we're talking to all the details of the Civil War, and maybe that's a podcast for another day. But yeah, I think that was my first kind of point, was just how much has been written about Lincoln and the Civil War. It's like it's never ending, and I'm sure it will continue to grow as the decades and centuries continue.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I actually took an American history course in university, and sadly, I don't remember enough of it. Probably should have paid more attention. But I do remember the majority of that course was dedicated to the Civil War, and the level of detail that professor ended up going into might have been a bit of a disservice to the general students who were just kind of taking it because you had to take an American history course. But right. Yeah, to your point, there are probably, dozens and dozens and dozens of courses that cover just the Civil War and not just like a survey of American history.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think we've kind of focused on keeping it as light as we can here. And I think I was telling you offline, I was looking into Reconstruction a little bit and after the Civil War, and there was an entire course of like 17 lectures that I found on YouTube that somebody had. I think it was at Yale, and it's like, yeah, this is what you're dealing with content. So see if we can keep it a little bit more bite-sized than that. So maybe, Richie, I think
we'll try our best.
Kick it off and tell us a little bit about this famous man named Abraham Lincoln and kind of where he came from.
For sure, yeah. So we can get started. I'll do a bit of his bio, and then we'll kind of pivot to that broader decision point. So we'll start off, as we usually do, childhood and early life. I think it's always a good starting point to kind of set the context. So Lincoln was born on February 2nd, 1809, to Nancy and Thomas Lincoln in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His family moved to southern Indiana in 1816. His formal schooling was quite limited. Based on what I read, it was like 3 very brief periods in his local schools, as he had to work constantly to support his family. In 1830, his family moved to Mason County in southern Illinois, and Lincoln got a job working on a river flatboat hauling freight down the Mississippi to New Orleans. After settling in the town of New Salem, Illinois, he worked as a shopkeeper and postmaster, and there he became involved in local politics as a supporter of the Whig Party. He actually won an election to the Illinois state legislature in 1834. In 1836, he was self-taught in law and actually passed the bar examination. The following year, he moved to the newly named state capital of Springfield, Illinois. And for the next few years, he worked as a lawyer and served clients ranging from the individual residents of small towns to his, I would assume, his more fruitful clientele, which were national railroad lines, where he kind of built his wealth over, his adulthood. But I think just before we kind of glaze over that, because I think there's a lot of underlying themes there that are quite important. One, he's moving through the frontier, which I don't know if people can actually imagine what that looks like and how it must feel. But, a lot of because he's a very well-documented guy. He has dozens of biographers, a lot of content that has been written about him. Lincoln himself summed up his early years on the frontier in Kentucky and Indiana as the short and simple annals of the poor. But the hardships weren't unique to his family or his youth either. Life was harsh for most frontier families in the early 1800s. It was just a reality of life at that point. There's another quote from a Lincoln historian named Michael Burlingame. Life on the frontier was little better than the life of an ox. But the Lincolns, he says, were especially poor. So you got to consider that he's growing up in the frontier in a log cabin, a one-room log cabin. And he's able to kind of, work past that, teach himself law without any formal schooling. So I guess it kind of speaks to, maybe some of that innate intellect and skill that we'd see later in his life.
I think even you talk about that frontier time and the challenges that they would go through, just being able to survive the winter is step one. Can you do that? Never mind, can you become president of the United States one day? And I think, again, it's the theme of there's something innate in a lot of these leaders that we see coming from, these more modest backgrounds and even straight up poor backgrounds in this situation. So yeah, and there's a picture right there. And I think for those listening on the audio, just think of a shed, basically a large shed. And that's what they lived in. You see it all over places in Canada and the US, and you're like, yeah, this was a house where, an entire family of 11 lived, and they've managed to make it work. So yeah, it's not what you would see as an aristocratic family growing up where yes, our son's going to, live a life of politics, where we would see with some other people, but a different time. And it's only 200 years ago too, which is even more wild when you really think about it.
Yeah. It's a snap of the fingers on the historical timeline, right? Paul, to your point, this is a glorified shed, right? Mm-hmm. It is a glorified shed. I also have another, painting actually that depicts young Lincoln in the cabin reading by the fireside. It is a very romanticized picture of what I imagine he's actually going through. But it's meant to kind of depict this, this kind of boyish image of young Lincoln on the frontier, still, head in the books because he's obviously astute. As we know, he did teach himself law, but this kind of contrast between, this kind of boyish innocence and intellect versus the reality of what he's dealing with, which is the very harsh reality of frontier living.
And it's a different kind of doing your homework late at night or learning late at night is you're constricted by light sources too, right? If it's a cold night, everyone's huddled around the fire. You might not get enough light to even read, which I kind of like this picture of just he's got the opportunity to, stay up late into the night and use every ounce of light that he has. But again, it's just the challenges laid out before someone just to even survive, let alone become educated, is not something every person back then is going to go through. And again, someone who's not going to become the president of the United States.
Yeah, and even to that point, right? And we'll have some more images later in the video, but on top of all of that, he lost his mom, he lost his infant brother, his sister, and his first sweetheart. It just goes to show you the reality, the toughness, the sadness that he had to endure as a young man growing up. we can move forward a little bit, but once we kind of bypass all of that, we can. He actually goes to meet Mary Todd. She is a well-to-do Kentucky belle with many suitors. Ironically, or coincidentally, I should say, one of those suitors would actually be Stephen Douglas, future political rival of Lincoln. So a little bit of extra spice there, just for dramatic flair. They ended up getting married in 1842. They went on to have 4 children. The only one would live into adulthood. That was Robert Todd Lincoln, Edward Baker Lincoln, William Wallace Lincoln, and Thomas Tad Lincoln.
I think it even goes to show just the list of names you're reading off there, right? Of just the mortality rate back then of, like we were saying, like just even to survive is this challenge every day. And we've got what you named off: the mother, children. Like it definitely adds up, and it's a constant challenge to get to that point and to even better yourself. I think it just goes to show when you start to put some numbers to it, it makes things like that could be like 50% of the people he knew in a given time. Like it's something that I think I can't fathom, right? Yeah.
Yeah, me neither. Yeah, I couldn't even imagine losing that many people in my life, especially over the duration of as you're growing up into adulthood. And one of the things that, I don't think we'll have time to touch on, but one of the things that I came across that I found was interesting was that a lot of historians kind of agree on the sentiment that he suffered from depression. And I think we had talked about offline a few weeks ago when we were kind of brainstorming about this podcast, was that he was taking this thing called blue mass, which was a remedy of sorts. I'll call it a remedy. I won't call it medicine. I'll call it a remedy.
1800s remedies are classic. That's for sure.
That was given to people who were suffering from depression. And he actually was known for having weird, angry outbursts, a lot of weird self-talk. You would hear him talking to himself a lot of the time. He was very agitated. And a lot of people didn't understand why necessarily until, I guess, it came to light through some sort of historical analysis that blue mass actually contained mercury. So he eventually would stop taking it, but just an interesting tidbit there in terms of, I guess his emotional state, the depression that he kind of dealt with as a man based on all he kind of went through and all the people that he lost, and, the remedy that he was taking that in all likelihood was actually causing him a lot of mental grief on top of everything else that was going on. From there, we can kind of jump into his formal entryway into politics. So Lincoln won the election to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846 and began serving his term the following year. As a congressman, he was unpopular for many Illinois voters for a strong stance against the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was from 1846 to 1842, and essentially it marked the first U.S. armed conflict chiefly fought on foreign soil. And it pitted a politically divided and militarily unprepared Mexico against a very expansionist-minded U.S. President James K. Polk, who believed the United States had a manifest destiny to spread across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. And I think that's probably a theme we should kind of touch on quickly. It's quite an interesting thing. This kind of stuck out to me when I was actually in that course I was kind of telling you about earlier. But so this phrase, manifest destiny, it's a phrase coined in 1845. It's the idea that the United States is, preordained, destined by God, as its advocates believe, to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. This philosophy drove 19th century expansionist policies and was used to justify the forced removal of Native Americans and other groups from their homes. So this rapid expansion of the U.S., it plays many roles. It intensifies the issues of slavery as new states were added to the Union, which would ultimately lead to the Civil War. But there's also this kind of interesting dichotomy between Lincoln being against the war, the Mexican-American War, and how it's related to this idea of manifest destiny, which is something that's also kind of uniquely coupled to his life, right? Because he is kind of a product of that westward expansion. So just to not much else to say on that, but I think it's quite an interesting contrast and juxtaposition.
Yeah, and I think we kind of saw that too. Like, we go back to our very first episode with Sir John A. Macdonald, right, having the same sort of viewpoint of westward expansion. And I think it's almost this fear of missing out for all of these nation states, just trying to get that, coast to coast coverage, for lack of a better term. Because if they don't, they're always worried that someone else will come next. And I think, calling it a destiny is, one way to put it, and it helps, when you want to remove certain individuals and start wars with other countries, it makes, that conversation a bit easier. But it is yet a really good and an important point as the U.S. does start to expand westward. We see slavery being a very north and south sort of thing, typically due to climate, right? As you have slaves in the north, growing cotton is typically what slaves are used for, and it doesn't really work when you have frost and snow like that. And going west, it's the same, right? So as those states start to come in, it creates an interesting kind of issue for someone like Lincoln and these other presidents to deal with. How does slavery move west? Because it's clear how it moves north to south, but does it move east to west the same way?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think that's something that I think that gradually the conversation is going to drift in that direction. So from there, we can start discussing kind of his foray into like national politics. Stephen Douglas, a leading Democrat in Congress, pushed through the passage of what's known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which essentially declared that voters of each territory, rather than the federal government, had the right to decide whether the territory should be slave or free. And I think, Paul, you'll probably get into it later, but this is, based on what I know at least, this is kind of one of the fundamental issues of the, why the Civil War started. This kind of this tension between federal and states' rights that we can, talk a little bit about later. So this act is passed. Lincoln, on October 16th, 1854, actually goes in front of a large crowd in Peoria to debate the merits of the Kansas-Nebraska Act with Douglas, denouncing slavery and its extension and calling the institution a violation of the most basic tenets of the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure the southern states loved hearing that.
Oh, yes. I'm sure they were all hanging up pictures of Lincoln and just thanking him for everything he's done. But I think you just hit on the core U.S. issue of U.S. politics from, independence to the moment we're recording this podcast of, state rule and call it states' rights. I can't think of a better term. I'm not a huge fan of it, but that's whole states' rights versus what the national government, federal government wants to do. And it comes to an interesting point of, yes, let the people of those, let people decide how they want to be governed. But you're trying to have a union. And if certain states want to think differently than other group of states, foreshadowing something coming here, I'm sure you can guess what it is, that's going to cause a lot of friction. And, for Lincoln to come out and say very explicitly that, this is an affront and this cannot happen is kind of very, very different than that, whole states' right thing that kind of always kind of existed from the beginning of, let the states govern the way they want to govern and being part of a union where everybody comes together. But naturally, things are going to change. And so, again, it boils into kind of where you can see how Lincoln thinks about these kind of issues and how it ultimately leads to his thoughts on slavery and ultimately who can make decisions on what the state wants to do versus the entire union itself.
100%. And I think there's this underlying reality, right, within the context of this time period and these debates. So I didn't know there were 7 debates, actually, that happened as a part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which pretty much just kind of boiled down into, they focused on slavery in terms of, whether it was constitutional or unconstitutional to have slavery between across the different states. What's interesting about these debates, though, that kind of, like, again, when we study history, especially in like the modern era, and I know people are like 1800s is not modern. It's modern. It is very modern relative to the pre-modern era, which is very, very different. this is like a media event, right? Like this is very comparable to a modern day media event. You have this kind of subtext of what's going on within the states. This discussion on slavery, which is very poignant. Everyone's kind of concerned about it, and what's going to be happening along all this new territory that's being acquired. The two that come to mind is the Louisiana Purchase, which was the purchase. I didn't know how big this was. I knew it was large. I didn't know it was this large. 828,000 square miles purchased from France for $15 million US, which is now equivalent to $400 million today, which still seems like a steal. That seems pretty
Absolutely.
cheap, right?
Yeah,
like, I was like, $400 million doesn't sound like a lot.
You can buy a condo in New York City for $15 million, let alone half the country, right? And all the natural resources that you can find.
I have a quick diagram because I want to show people how large this is.
Oh
it
my
is
goodness,
literally
it's
the
even
middle
larger
of the
than
US.
I thought, yeah.
Yeah,
So that
me
goes
too.
what, from Louisiana all the way up to Montana, but it's what, 1, 2, 3, like almost like 9 states, 10 states
Yep.
in there.
We got the Dakotas, we got Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, a little bit of Colorado. We're touching a bit of New Mexico, top of Texas. Like, it's huge. It is literally the middle of the US.
That's at least a third of the continental United States.
Mhm.
For
And then on
$400
top
million
of that,
in today's
on top-
dollars is, yeah.
it's insane. And then on top of that, right? So you have all these new states that are just, popping up here and there, along with what's happening between, so it's referred to as the Mexican Secession, a treaty signed after the U.S.-Mexican War of 1848, where Mexico seceded 55% of its territories. So that includes pretty much, let me zoom in a bit, all of California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, most of Arizona, Colorado, parts of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. So think about how many territories and states are popping up now in a very, very short period of time. There's questions around the new states, what are the boundaries, governance, and with all of that, where does the institution of slavery stand, right, with these new states?
And again, like we were talking, like it's a north, very north and south sort of thing. And, the climate in the southeast, I guess, of the U.S. is perfect for a lot of the things that, again, cotton is the main thing, right? But then you kind of come west and you have like a more desert territory. It's like, okay, from a economics perspective, does slavery even make sense in a place like this? Are you really going to be having vast plantations where you need a lot of manual labor? Maybe, maybe not. But I don't think that's the point, right? It's now slave state versus non-slave state in a kind of grouping of power between the North and the South. And I think we'll get into it a little bit more, but this is really, when they talk about, states' rights as being one of the reasons why kind of everything kicked off, is what did these states think on slavery? And it's kind of like, it's almost like their team, right? Like, this is the team you're on. You're on team slavery or team no slavery. And regardless of how you think about slavery as a institution or whatever you want to call it, doesn't really matter. This is our team, and we are pro-slavery or anti-slavery.
Yeah, the ideological kind of camps, right, that are divided there. And I think this is kind of what it boiled down to during those debates. And essentially what came out of them, Douglas, as a Democratic candidate, held the decision that the new states should decide themselves whether they would be slave states or not, and that the decision should be taken away from the federal government. Whereas Lincoln at the time argued against the expansion of slavery, yet stressed that he was not advocating for its abolition where it already existed. So I think we're getting an interesting glimpse into, the politics, the tactician, the diplomacy, and the communication skills to ensure that he's not going to bite off more than he can chew at that point in time, right? And I think that kind of boils down to his shrewdness, which is a characteristic that his biographers, use a lot, which is not a word that I really thought of when I thought about Abe Lincoln, but apparently, his biographers do kind of see him in that light.
And I think it goes to show, I was going to say, the whole, I'm not going to call for the abolition of slavery, because he knows that's essentially a death wish at that point, because,
exactly.
The institution of slavery is so strong in the South. And if you were to cut that out, there is this, again, we have a war that's coming up that's directly linked to that. But at the same time, there's a level of, we talked about a little bit offline about the cotton gin and industrialization kind of happening, where throwing free labor at a problem is not the most economically sound strategy anymore. And as automation starts to continue going, right, dealing with the backlash of slavery around the world, dealing with, again, these are people you have to guard and house and give shelter to, where you can buy a piece of machinery. And it starts to become this really weird economic sort of conversation. And I think some of the research I was doing with reading about Lincoln was a lot of people were thinking look, slavery is just going to naturally get to a point where no one's really going to want it around it anymore, or where it's not as profitable as it once was. And, maybe this will help us avoid a war. It doesn't end up being that, but I think in the back of Lincoln's mind, he's like, if we can get to a point where we can convince enough people that this is not economically sound as it once was, and maybe there's a way we can have, maybe the states themselves have that conversation. But again, he clearly wants that national push to say, well, new states are not going to be slave states, and then potentially have a majority in the non-slave category. But as we'll see, that doesn't really work out that way.
Yeah, totally. And I think you kind of touch on a very interesting point there. So this is a national discussion, right, that is going to impact coast to coast, state to state, in terms of what's eventually going to come about in terms of how we're going to deal with slavery moving forward. And these debates, right, I think it's an interesting point, because they actually generated a lot of newspaper coverage and media intensity. From what I read, it seemed like the winner, quote unquote, of these debates was Lincoln. It kind of propelled him, into this kind of meteoric rise, and got him a lot of fandom in terms of his political persuasion, and how he was kind of seen from a voting perspective by the public. Whereas Douglas, was still on the scene, but it didn't really help him much. If anything, it might have even been a detriment to him. Because Lincoln was a great orator, something that I think many would know. But I think there's a cool point here that, from an historical analysis perspective, is one of those themes that would likely go underappreciated, because we live in an era of perpetual and constant media engagement. But during this era, these debates kind of read like modern media events. Considering the technology that's kind of being popularized and becoming more mainstream at the time, you have the availability of railroads, because they're traveling from city to city to do these debates. You have the telegraph, which kind of cuts down on time to actually share what's going on from different states. You have the invention of what's called Pitman shorthand, or phonography, which essentially allows journalists and reporters to capture verbatim what's being said at these debates, so they can transcribe them later, and then use the telegraph to share it, or using print media. You also have photography that's catching on and becoming much more mainstream as well. So it's very interesting, the media storm that kind of was created around this. And it's funny to say media storm 60s, right? It's not something you would immediately kind of connect, but it very much reads like this. And I think that's just an interesting point to kind of to bring up, that there was a lot of exposure and coverage on these debates.
It's a technological shift too, right? I think they talk about, with television and social media and the radio, and this is even one step behind it. I think, again, that instant feedback of information for the time, right? If you can get something within a matter of, it used to take, weeks and days, but this is a matter of maybe minutes and hours, where if you're transcribing something in real time, sending it over the telegram, printing it out, and it's in the paper the next day, or people are being able to consume that live, it really changes the ball game on, Lincoln potentially having to go town to town and talking in the town square to get votes, and that could take months, versus I can do one speech anywhere and the whole nation knows about it by the time they wake up the next day.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think and I'll just mention this quickly, but your point on technological innovation, right? I think we are seeing a society in transition, and, in terms of how that kind of impacts the Civil War, right? There is that kind of theme there in terms of the technological shift that's happening as one of the precursors and potential reasons why the Civil War did happen, in terms of the technological innovations and the distinctions between the northern and southern states. But yeah, I think it's a super interesting parallel. We'll jump into his presidential campaign. So again, his profile is rising meteorically at this point in time. He delivered another speech in New York. It's pandemonium. It's so well received that the Republicans choose Lincoln as their candidate for president. Essentially, he was chosen over senators who had much more political expertise and experience than he did. But the Republicans chose what was the word that they used? A rangy Illinois lawyer with only one undistinguished congressional term under his belt. And I think this is where the branding genius and tactical nature of Abe Lincoln kind of really shows out, according to his biographers. This is kind of the idea of Honest Abe versus Old Abe versus Rail Splitter, which kind of is really this kind of constructed and manufactured public image that he is very, very strategic about creating. This idea of him being a small town lawyer, although he represented, corporate railroad interests and, was often on the corporate side defending, litigation issues. But they packaged his roots of being on the farm, this idea of him being straight from the land or being a rail splitter, which was much more potent than obviously Lincoln, the railroad lawyer, which obviously, might not sell and kind of land as well amongst the general population.
Especially in a world where, you're expanding west into these, I guess, uninhabited and more, not built up areas where people are working those blue collar jobs, working the railroad, working on farms, working in small factories, working in small shops. And to be able to be like, hey, I'm one of you and I understand the hard work you guys are putting in. I think we do see that a lot, right? It's the Washington outsider, right? Who kind of came from noble beginnings and kind of rose up, versus not coming from like a rich Manhattan family or something like that. And it's interesting to see how that kind of started back then, because it draws, so many parallels today of this outsider who comes from, humble beginnings and can relate.
The everyman,
right? The everyday working man, right?
Yeah. It's just funny how that still sells, and it's it even over a century ago and it's still relevant. But if we take a look at the general election for that year, Lincoln again is faced against Douglas, who represents the Northern Democrats, and he beats out Douglas. He builds an exceptionally strong cabinet composed of many of his political rivals, which is quite an interesting move. But soon after he is elected, sectional tensions that have always been there between the northern and southern states, or the pro or anti-slavery states. This is kind of the nail in the coffin. So the election of an anti-slavery northerner as the 16th president of the U.S. drove many southerners over the brink. Like, this was the point of no return. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th president on March 1861, I think it was 7 southern states had seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. So this might be a good transition point, Paul, to kind of do our best to put a nice little bow on the Civil War so people can understand the broader context.
Definitely. I think there's a piece here of just kind of discussing the lay of the land and where things are, and then we can kind of slip past kind of the fighting and the troop movements and that kind of stuff to when the Union ends up being victorious and how they handle a defeated South. But I guess kind of the pretext that's important to kind of note, and we've kind of touched on it already, is, you know, the North is moving to this more manufacturing, automation type of economy, and they're making a lot of money and becoming much more wealthy than the South is. The South is very rural with lots of plantations dominating the economy. And one thing to remember too is, yes, the South is definitely dominated by slaves, but it's also dominated too by a lot of poor white people who are working on these farms for these really rich plantation owners. So it's a very almost like a feudalistic society where you would see, you know, back in like 14th century France, right, where you have the lord who kind of runs the show, and then you have communal farmers, and there's a level to that too of subsistence farming and different things like that. So that's kind of how that economy is being driven. And I believe I saw a stat, it was like 25% of the world's cotton was coming from the US South. So just to give you an idea of the absolute scale of what is coming out of the South. And then on top of that, the fashion industry and the textile industry is exploding at this time. So, you know, 25% of a world economy that is continuously growing, so that the need for more and more cotton continues to rise, and these plantation owners are getting very, very rich as a result. And again, they don't want that to change. But, you know, slavery being what it is and how brutal and disgusting of a thing it was back then, is you can see people start to ask the questions of, is this ethically a good thing to do? And we see at that time, Britain and many other countries have outlawed slavery altogether. And the U.S. is kind of this one of the few modern nations that's left that actually allows slavery to continue. So again, it starts with this, you know, Western expansion and things we talked about. And there's a kind of a piece that happens on almost like this happening makes war inevitable. And we talked about states' rights and letting the states kind of make those decisions for themselves. And so before the Civil War kicks off, Kansas joins as a new state into the United States. And that conversation of let's let the states decide, because they're a new state. We're not going to say they're pro or anti-slavery. Let's let them decide. Well, the problem is, it's not just, you know, people got to get to Kansas. This isn't just like there's a bunch of people living in Kansas that are just like, oh, okay, we'll make a decision now. This is people immigrating, for lack of a better term, to Kansas. But these people are not just coming to just, oh, I'm going to set up my family business here and then I'll decide if I want slavery or not. They're actively going there to make Kansas a slave state or a non-slave state. And there's this event called Bleeding Kansas, which takes place. And it's essentially like if you want to say true start to the Civil War, is a very violent outbreak happens over many, many years, where pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners are coming in and basically fighting it out to decide Kansas's future. And there's some quite nasty atrocities that happen on the side of, you know, both sides, trying to get Kansas to kind of fall into the camp of slavery or anti-slavery. And again, a lot of this is like, we see like, this is not so much a noble cause by a lot of the Northerners too. There's definitely a level of abolitionists who are like, we don't want slavery, it's terrible, we need to get rid of it. But there's this, we're the North, we want control. We don't want to have to live the Southern way of life. We want power in politics and things like that. So this isn't necessarily just, you know, out of the goodness of their hearts. There's a personal kind of power move coming here. So, like you said, Lincoln gets elected, and who's openly anti-slavery. And I think there's a speech here, and like there's many, many quotes from Lincoln, but like imagine a Southerner and you hear this quote. So this is from a speech from Lincoln in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1859. He says, quote, "I think slavery is wrong, morally and politically. I desire that it should have no further spread in these United States, and I should not object if it should gradually terminate in the whole Union." So again, that whole, it should not expand westward, and it should probably terminate. I like how he says gradually, though. Like, he's definitely trying to avoid that. We're not going to just pass a law to ban it. We're going to kind of massage it out of the system. But again, there's enough here that enough people are spooked by this guy's going to, you know, drop a bombshell on us and, you know, basically pass a law to say we're not going to have slavery anymore, and our whole way of life is going to end. And I think seeing what's going on in Kansas this is an inevitable next step for the Union. So the war happens, the quickest Civil War overview you'll ever hear is the war happens and the Union wins. Really, the key piece of the Union winning is that manufacturing, that really strong economy, really takes over. And once the Union kind of gets into their wheels in motion, for lack of a better term, they're able to defeat the South. And now they have a South that they got to figure out what to do with. And so you have a number of leaders on the Confederate side who actively moved, were in Congress and other positions and said, we want nothing to do with the Union. We're going to create our own country. You have generals like General Lee, who actively fought in the U.S. Army and joined the Confederates. And then you have all the foot soldiers. These are people who, again, those poor white Southerners who worked on plantations, who picked up arms. And one of the most interesting things that I saw was I was flipping through some different Confederate fighters, and there was actually a Cherokee battalion of the Confederate Army. So these are Native Americans fighting on the side of the Confederacy, which is always weird to me because part of the Confederacy is this white supremacy sort of, black people are lesser than white people. And I would love to learn more about it. I think it's just a fascinating piece of like, what really drove them to get to that point? Was it hey, we kind of like the way things are going, and if we're on the winning side, we can get something out of this, and our survival depends on it? Or was there something else going on? But it was just a little interesting tidbit that I saw as I was flipping through. So the war ends, and now you have three kind of Confederate leaders here that I'll focus on and just talk about how, their next steps into their life, and how I was just utterly shocked at what kind of happened to all of these leaders. Like, you think after a civil war, so like for someone like, we've talked about some civil wars, like you look what happened in China and you look at what happened in Russia, these revolutions, these civil wars where they end, and they end very, very bloody. If you were on the losing side, your family, anybody you know is probably not living, or at the very least exiled. And reading about like Roman history too, like when Augustus takes over Rome, there's like a year-long purge where he's murdering tens of thousands of political rivals to really establish his hold on the country. But then we look at the United States Civil War, and it has the most calm, peaceful end to a war. There's really
funny
nobody
you say that though, right?
Yeah,
it's like, the aftermath of the Civil War is where there's this kind of like cleansing of all the people that either were a part of it, helped kind of move it forward. And maybe just to kind of level set with the listeners. So the Civil War lasted, 4 years? 1861 to 65?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, and the number of casualties, I saw some ranges from like 700,000-ish to well over 1 million. So the level of destruction and death in your own country is mind-blowing. These are
at the hands of your fellow citizens too. This is not a foreign enemy. This is your neighbor. These are people you are passing laws with. These are people that you've gone to war with against other nations.
This is not an external threat.
Yes,
right? Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Which is like it's something the U.S. has never faced before. Many countries have had civil wars and revolutions, but for the United States, like outside of the revolution to become a country, they've never fought against their fellow citizens. And so there is this level kind of coming from Lincoln on, well, how do we deal with the Southerners? We have two options. We kill a lot of them. We lock them up. We exile them. We have a very bloody end to this war, and we say, you don't screw around with us like this again. Anybody who has these thoughts, you'll face, a firing squad or whatever it might be. Or the other option where it was like, all right, guys, this was a misunderstanding. Let's get back to business as usual. But that slavery thing, that's got to go. And that's essentially kind of for how things go down. So I'll give you a quick overview of three Confederate leaders. So we have General Lee, who was the general of the Confederate Army. He was, at the end of the war, allowed to just go home, went back to Virginia. He was stripped of his citizenship, but he was still able to live a normal life. He ended up becoming president of Washington College at some point. And just, again, he lived a normal life, and a successful life as well. there's some writings from Lee on how he was kind of didn't want to be glorified and things like that. But at the end of the day, like, this guy led the Confederate Army and was just told to go home. Like, I've had enough of you, go home. Like, almost like a kid who's like, go in time out for a bit. Okay, now you've thought about what you've done.
Go think about what you've done.
Yeah, and so he was actually given his citizenship back in 1975 by President Ford. So I think there's a whole legacy thing around these Confederate leaders and how the United States looks at these leaders. And so there's a few more in here. So we have Jefferson David, who was the president of the Confederate States. And so he was captured at the end of the war by the Union. They imprisoned him for a few years, but it's like, country club prison, right? He's not sitting in a dungeon or anything like that. He's able to write while he's in prison, and it's nothing too crazy. But at the end of the war, they struggled to like actually put him on trial because they didn't know what laws he actually broke, because he wasn't a U.S. citizen when he broke all of these laws. He seceded. He's like, I'm not a U.S. citizen anymore. So theoretically, he did everything he did outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. And so now, is he a foreign enemy? Like, what do we do about that? And it kind of like, just seemed like it was something that dragged on and on and on, and they kind of just forgot about it. And they were just like, all right, go back to living your life. So he wasn't able to live like a super extravagant life, but he was able to try and, go back to the U.S., regain some of his property, and lived a somewhat normal life again till the end of his days. And then there's Alexander Stephens, who is the VP of the Confederate States, and he's known for making this infamous speech called the Cornerstone Speech. And so before the war even started, basically, and this is kind of puts to bed any conversation about what the Civil War was actually about. He basically says African Americans are not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is the natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, physiological, and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all of the truths in various departments of science. So I love the little part at the end, science, because science has proven that, us as white men are are superior to these African slaves. So again, that he's the one who puts the stamp on, we're doing this because we are better than another race of people, and that's the way it should go down. And there's some great quotes from Abraham Lincoln kind of taking a quote like this and just saying like, well, if color of your skin, lightness of skin is the most important thing, well, what are you going to do when someone who's got lighter skin than you shows up? Do they have the right to enslave you? And then he kind of goes down like, oh, what if you say white people are smarter than black people? Okay, well, what if someone who's smarter than you comes along? Do they have the right to enslave you as well? And you can just see that's, Lincoln just being like, come on, guys, look how silly this is.
Yeah, this is a dumb argument. This is a really dumb argument.
Like, you're going to have to do a lot better than that. Like, if you'd almost respect them more if they came out and said, like, look, we're really rich and we don't want that to change, and that's why we're doing this. Like, hey, we respect it more, but that's not going to rally
change
anything
behind
it. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
not going to change anything.
About 12 guys who are like, yeah, that's great, and the rest are like, not so sure I can get behind that. So for Alexander Stephens, he's imprisoned for treason 5 months after the war. Then he's let go, kind of goes back to his life, ends up serving in Congress for 8 years after, until his death. Like, it's just mind-blowing to me. Not that only that, he makes a speech like this, he loses the war, he's imprisoned for basically no time at all, and then he's able to get back into Congress and start passing laws again. It's still something that just blows my mind from kind of an outsider's perspective on, like, at the very least, imprisoned or stripped of the ability to vote, or even, saying, hey, you can live, but you got to go to Mexico, or you can go to Canada, or you can go to Britain, but you can't stay here. And so that just kind of is the whole thing around how these leaders were allowed to continue on. And then again, these are just the top leaders, and people below them, foot soldiers and generals and colonels and people involved in the Confederate government, are able to live their lives and come back to passing laws within their own states. Which, again, if you look at
nuts,
how,
though, eh?
Yeah,
like how that kind of played out over I wonder what laws he passed. Like, that was the first question that came to mind when you were discussing. I want to Google it after, but I'm super curious to know, what laws did he pass, or kind of were, to his name after the fact. Like, was he trying to reinstate slavery? Like, what was his focus those 8 years?
Or was he maybe just sitting there being stubborn, crossing his arms, and being like, "Nope, we're not doing that. Nope, we're filibustering that."
Everything.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds again very reminiscent of today.
Exactly right. And so it's just this whole thing, and I can't really get over, how they allowed this to happen. And so the key thing though is Lincoln is assassinated, really close to the end of the war. Like, I think the last official shots were fired after Lincoln was killed. And so Andrew Johnson, his vice president, has taken up a lot of this work. And so to say this is directly Lincoln's kind of, I guess the outcome is based on what Lincoln decided is a half-truth. I think there's some stuff here where he speaks about what he wants to happen. So the idea is definitely Lincoln's, the execution is not. So there's an address Lincoln makes in March 1865, and he talks about this thing called Reconstruction. Like, how are we going to get back to building a nation, building a union again? So he says, with malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace amongst ourselves and with all nations. So the key point there is he doesn't differentiate between North and South. He doesn't differentiate between Union and Confederacy. He sees this reconstruction of an entire nation, and he's very much saying we need to make sure that we treat everybody correctly. We make sure that, the people who lost their father, who lost their brother, who lost their husband, in the war, and even if they live from the South, we need to make sure we give them the opportunity to come back and join the Union and prosper in a way that, we want to give, Americans all the chances, they possibly can. So in Lincoln's mind, like, this is let's bring everybody together again. And so he gave his generals even directions, like, if the Confederate leaders try to flee to Mexico, let them go. Like, I don't want anybody running them down and having public executions, because I think there's also a fear of, say General Lee gets caught and hung. He now becomes a martyr for this concept of the Confederacy and slavery. And then he kind of makes a point of, instead of lawyers arguing about the legality of secession, which again was clearly an issue because they didn't know how to try a lot of these guys, arguing that legality of secession, the death of, 800,000 to 1 million Americans, the nation would put all of those resources into rebuilding and creating a stronger nation. So he definitely has this idea of, let's not be cruel at the end of the war. Let's bring everybody back into it. And that's, I think, kind of comes into the discussion of, was that the right decision? And, how did it come to pass? And so, like, one of the things when it comes to the actual execution of it is they did some things where they made the Confederate soldiers and people who wanted to basically rejoin the Union, like, swear a oath to the Constitution and to the Union. Sure. There's something very interesting in all of this. They swore that oath to the Union, but they did not swear it to, slavery itself. They said, hey, I'll swear to the Constitution, but I won't swear to say I'm going to give up this slavery nonsense, forever. And so it's like a little bit of a, we just got to bring everybody together. And the, the years afterwards where we get into Jim Crow and the South kind of doing everything they can to make
the lasting, like the enduringness of the institution, right? That would kind of be propelled and live into the modern era, decades, potentially even a century later, would still be an issue with segregation laws, Jim Crow. Yeah, you're totally right.
Right. Yeah, and I think the key thing here was, I was reading at the end of the war, the South had about 40% of the wealth that the North did. There was a lot of money that was forfeited because it was essentially transferred into the bonds that were run by the Confederate government that essentially became worthless. So banks, railroads, everything was going bankrupt. And so now you have a group of people who, again, have lost a lot of men of working age. There's no savings. There's no money. And then you also have, like, you have to think of like worker skill, right? Like if you just have a bunch of plantations, most people just really know how to farm. There's not like, oh, we're going to move in and build a factory, build all these other things.
It's a single crop economy too, right? Like,
yes, right.
It's large. It's not like it's a diversified variety of crops that they're dependent on. It's one single crop that's kind of dominating or taking up the majority of their efforts, which is just cotton.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you see kind of this transition after the war. Well, it's like, well, if slaves aren't around, we'll just hire people and pay them what we can, right? And again,
it's so crazy because it's like,
yeah.
no shit, right? Like,
yeah.
Maybe we should have just done that in the first place.
But then it's like, how can, and this is where people get clever, right? It's, oh, we're not allowed to have slaves, but what if we allow, we'll call them freed slaves, I guess at this point, they can work on the farm, but they must produce a certain quota of food on a land that we give them. And then if they don't produce that, we take away from their personal stuff. And then they give them some housing as a result. But if they don't
still
provide,
kind of
they lose that housing.
Yeah, still very feudalistic, right? Yeah.
It's slavery in the sense that everything is the same other than the fact that you can get up and leave. But again, get up and leave to go where, right? This is your life. This is what you have. You have a family. You need to feed them. You can't just get up and go. And especially in the South, being a black person at the time you're not walking down the street and just getting another job. This is, again, there's still this most of the people living in that place were just seceded from a country because they thought their race was better than your race. So this is not hey, let's all join hands and say, oh, sorry about that misunderstanding. There's still a deep hatred. There's still I guess like this, it's just not going to flip over overnight. And I think where Lincoln was kind of coming was, okay, if we're nice to everybody and we can slowly bring everybody back and show that we care and we want everything to be equal in this sense, we can make it work. But then that also could have, what I've kind of written down here is some options for kind of how Lincoln could have treated this. He could have said, well, we got two things. Do we put pressure on the South? We force equal treatment for all. And they must have northern values. You treat everybody the same. And again, I do say northern values. The North was still incredibly racist at the time. This is not,
100%.
It's not, again, like the North everybody was equal. There's a lot of, still new immigrants coming into the country. And there's still a lot of issues with Irish immigrants, for example, coming into the eastern part of the United States and them facing a lot of racism and stuff from the existing population. So there's a level of, okay, do you force the South to treat everybody the same, allow everybody to have the same vote, the same level of representation? Or do you kind of back off and say, okay, we're going to treat everybody well, but we're going to try to get things changed through the democratic process? And I think, Lincoln does choose the second one. Andrew Johnson has the second option there. And it really goes off the rails for about, really, I guess, until you could say the 1960s, until really the Civil Rights Act gets passed. It's almost 100 years, really, of just not really closing that final loop. And I think where we are today is, even from 1960 to today is a heck of an improvement. But it still kind of goes back to that, do you force people into changing? And would have that even worked versus trying to change the hearts and minds, right? Yeah.
I don't think so. I think an institution like slavery, the enduring legacy of it, and I know we're talking about the Civil War, so we're talking in a North American, U.S. specific context.
Right.
But just if we kind of expand it out a little bit, like the institution of slavery has had such an enduring legacy across time and space that when you look at it from like this macro perspective, we're still having conversations about modern day slavery, in 2022. So, and then you kind of take it a step back to our discussion right now. We're talking about, the U.S. in the mid 19th century. It's so deeply entrenched in that region. It is culturally, socially, economically. It is central to those southern states, from my perspective. So. You're not going to change that overnight, right? Like, it's going to take I don't know if it should, like, clearly it's, I guess many would say it's still a work in progress, which, sure. But yeah, I think Lincoln was probably smart enough to realize that this isn't gonna be a quick fix, or it's not gonna happen overnight. Like, there's going to be a lot of change that's required. And I think that kind of sentiment, gradually doing it, or, kind of initiating it. Because even if he wasn't assassinated, do you think it would have moved faster? It was speculative history at this point, but...
Yeah. I don't even know if faster is even a possibility. I think
I don't know
it would have been done a bit cleaner.
Yeah, maybe efficiency, or like... Yeah.
But I think even, like, I was doing some reading too on, what do we do with these slaves kind of conversation was always a thing that was around in the United States. And like Jefferson even talked about it. He was convinced that when slavery eventually ended, he goes, African slaves cannot stay in the United States. He goes, there's no way that you can have all these people as slaves. Something like that, yeah.
Jefferson had a lot.
He's an interesting guy because I think, like, if you read his writings, he's very morally against it, but he kind of struggles with what else are you supposed to do at the time? Like, this is just kind of the way the world works. Again, that's another podcast, but it's an interesting kind of moral quandary that he has. But the interesting thing he kind of always thought was he wanted to actually just get the slaves that were in the U.S. and send them all to Haiti, because look, there was a slave rebellion there. He was worried about it happening in the United States, and even Lincoln had some conversations. His plan was to send slaves to Liberia, because the whole point was, like, the U.S. was going to set up an African colony over there, and we can send these slaves back to Africa. But then people started to realize, like, you had people like Frederick Douglass saying, like, you don't understand. We're American. We can't go back. I don't know.
We're not going back.
I don't know the language. I'm not African. I'm American, right? Like, I grew up as a slave, but this is my home, and I don't want to leave. And then you can start to see Lincoln kind of has that thought, and as time goes on, he starts to discuss more. He's like, I can't, in any sort of thought, send a ship of people from the United States and just dump them into another country and be like, bye, have fun, right?
Coastal Africa, get with it.
It's like, how's that going to work, right? So I think a lot of these leaders really knew, and Lincoln especially, like, this is not going to go over well. And even if it does work out, what's going to happen, especially in the South too. I don't have the number in front of me, but I think the proportion of African slaves to, white Americans living in the South is quite large at the time too. So there was always this fear of rebellion and some other sort of separation. So how that all came together, again, you can speculate all you want, but it almost like it probably was going to take 100 years. It was to get to a point where you could have a national conversation around what civil rights really are, and then take probably another 100 years until all of that gets rippled through, because you really have, people living in 1900, 1910, like, grandparents fought in the Civil War. They grew up around this conversation
it's not
of
far removed, right?
This lost cause of, we had an idea and it wasn't, I think that's another kind of conversation too, around, like, the South and this lost cause they talked about, on how, it was a good idea to separate because the North was being mean, and, we wanted states' rights. It really had nothing to do with slavery. But then you read the Cornerstone speech, and it's quite clear that slavery was the reason for the Confederacy. And then it kind of glorifies, the South as this, we were standing up for what we believed in, and we believed in our states' rights. And there's this level of rebellion within the United States as a noble cause, because that's how the country was created, of this rebellion against tyrannical leaders and kings and things like that. So I think it's kind of deeply entrenched in U.S. kind of mentality at the time of what kind of values that they have is, like, standing up to injustice and things that they don't believe in. And again, the South is, states' rights. We thought this is what we believed in, so we stood up and we rose against it. And that creates kind of this lost cause narrative that you add that into the inability for the United States to do Reconstruction in a positive way, kind of brought, again, those next 100 years until the Civil Rights Movement, where slavery is illegal, but everything else that you could do to oppress a group of people is not only around, it's thriving in a lot of these southern states.
I think it's an interesting point, right? Like if we drive the conversation back to that kind of decision point with Abe to decide what to do with the leaders. And while you were speaking, this kind of sentiment kind of popped up in my head. I know we've talked about it a couple times, especially with this particular era, the mid 19th century, the nation making projects that are going on. This is the nation making project in the U.S. and Lincoln's kind of his perspective on him trying to unify and come together and create a coast to coast nation that's integrated, that works together, that is largely on the same page when it comes to these institutions. I use the word largely very loosely there, but yeah, it's interesting because if the goal is nation making, right, unification, and this is a theme that I think we've touched on, like totally unintentionally, it just has kind of come about as a part of our discussions and research, that if the goal is unification, then can we hold Lincoln accountable for not taking a harsher line of punishment for the Confederate leaders?
It's a tough one because part of me, again, unification is the goal, but is there a way where you can rip out that any sort of sentiment to whatever the Confederacy had was good? And can you force in some way the laws of the land to, respect, that this everybody's equal, when the Constitution says all men, that means all men, not certain types of
landowning
people.
White guys. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. Can you do that? And it's a tough one for me because I get where Lincoln's coming from. And I just, again, you don't know, like, what would have happened if he took the top 1,000 Confederate leaders and exiled all of them or killed all of them and then put, northern troops. I don't
think he could have
South.
Exiled. So I think it's interesting, this idea of exiling. So
Yeah.
Given what we know about like the Mexican-American War, where are they most likely to go? Mexico.
Yeah.
Right? And given the secession that just happened,
right?
Are you just kind of creating a powder keg that is just going to build up over time, right? Potentially. Because now you've exiled them, but they're all together. They're still fomenting off this kind of idea. They're not, it's not finished. Which is why you go,
the more I think about it too,
kill
right?
or not, right? Like, do you execute them or do you not execute them at that point?
I think even as we talk about it too, is like we're talking like Lincoln had a choice here. Like, at the end of the day, this, I'm falling into the trap of Lincoln is a king or an emperor who has ultimate authority here. Ultimately, he needs to put every single person on trial. And I think the point of Lincoln saying he doesn't want the lawyers arguing about the legality of everything. He just wants to get things back together. And now that I kind of think about it like that, like if he did go down the route of harsh on the South, imprisonment, punishment, banishment, whatever you want to call it, that could have taken 10, 15 years of just legal court battles where...
Yeah.
And I guess in his eyes, he's like, what's the point? It's a waste of resources. We've talked about this even when we were talking about Neville Chamberlain and, World War II coming along and just after World War I. People are tired after war. They don't want to deal with it. They just want to move on. They want to get back to their lives. And I think that's kind of the mindset here. And so, maybe as we talk through it here, it may not have been even as much of a decision as maybe I thought it was when we came into this. This is more of he had to, he could have gone down that route of, sure, let's be tough. But, he knows law, obviously. He taught himself law. He's a lawyer. He's worked in Congress. He's worked in the Senate.
Yep.
He knows where this is going to go. And was it even really an option for him to be harsher from a legal standpoint. Maybe he could have been harsher with his words and put more pressure on the South from some different areas. But again, maybe that is not even his domain, right? That's more of an execution side of things versus a ideal side of things if he never had the opportunity to implement.
That's a good point. The more I think about it, I think out of the options that were presented earlier, exile, execute, or give mercy, or whatever form of mercy it looked like, right? Or just, I definitely think exile would have been the worst move, because I think that it's hard to kill an idea. Very, very hard to kill an idea. Ideas are very enduring, especially when they're super entrenched and are intrinsically tied to how your segment of society functions. Which kind of led me to the two last options, which would be either execute or, I guess, what I would call like integrate, bring them in, for the sake of unification. And obviously, when you think about things like this and you think about the casualties, you think about slavery and atrocities that were committed, your gut reaction is always like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. At least that's mine. I can't speak for everybody. That's always my gut reaction until I take a step back and kind of do some analysis and I kind of think about it. And given what I read about Lincoln's bio, his shrewdness, his tactician, his what I would call this almost very balanced, checked approach to how he would say things or kind of communicate his positioning or his kind of view on things, it makes me think that he was probably better off just providing mercy at that point for the sake of unification.
Yeah. And again, like, we talk about the lost cause happening as a result of, this idea not being destroyed in some way. And I think that where my head's kind of been going is like, well, if you kill the leaders and you tell people like you don't screw around with this anymore, that this idea will go away. I don't think that's going to work. And I think like showing mercy, I think makes sense to show like, again, you don't make martyrs out of these guys. You don't waste resources on whatever legal ramifications you have to do, and you actually go to the South. And again, who's going to make the call in the South? The people, right? Like this is still the U.S., still democracy. And if you can show that, the federal government is coming in and making, trying to get everybody back on their feet, which they did to some extent, maybe that shows that, we are unifying as a country. Now, then there's the question of how does the South view freed African slaves? Is a different discussion altogether. And is Lincoln going to go down and talk to every single person? Be like, the whole point you just fought and died for was irrelevant.
Good luck.
It's going to take centuries. It's going to take.
It's not a minority group, right? Like, this is a huge group of people. This is a significant portion of your citizenry that is tied to this institution and this kind of way of thinking, this ideology that propelled the Civil War. I think it would be short-sighted to think that you're just going to kill these people and the idea is just going to go away with them. I think, if anything, it's going to backfire, right? Yeah.
And I think, too, like we were saying, like, the North is not the, beacon of everybody loves everybody.
Enlightenment.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And again, you probably ask a lot of people in the North what their thoughts are on race relations. It would be, like, we don't agree with slavery. We think that's a little messed up. But, like, do we have to integrate our schools? Like, no, definitely not. Exactly. We can't be doing that. Yeah. Like, should everybody have a vote? Well, maybe not. Like, that kind of stuff,
depends. Yeah.
Right? Exactly. Like, I would love to see some information on, like, what people thought back then, because it's definitely not as straightforward as I think we're making it as. North is everybody's nice and loves everybody versus the South. Yeah. And I think for a lot of people you kind of see it as a theme kind of in the U.S. For many years, as if these, you have these poor white people who are, getting screwed by these plantation owners. But at the end of the day, they are still better than the most successful black person because they have this, what what the vice president of the Confederacy said, like, we are better based on science, which I still laugh at every time.
Whatever that means.
I got to see this scientific paper that they've created, because I'm sure it's, a first-rate comedy act on whatever they've created. But it's a fascinating thing, and I think, again, changing hearts and minds, there's really, you look through history, how do you do it? You do it with a lot of blood and a lot of fear. But the idea never dies, right? A lot of time.
A lot of time.
Yeah, and whatever your thoughts might be on certain things, it will go underground in some fashion, and you can suppress the hell out of it. And again, does it work? Maybe, but like we see, even you look at China and the revolution that kind of happened, and how Mao and the communists really stepped in and did everything that they did. It took generations to really embed that into the hearts and minds of the people, and a lot of those thoughts about freedom and democracy still kind of lingered and kind of came back a little bit too in China. Right? It was, and for a country that's so, like, look at them today. Like, imagine the Union had the surveillance state technology that, like, we have today, right? Like, even if they had that, you're not going to change the hearts and minds of people in maybe the way I thought. So I think
this get better at hiding things, right? People just get better at hiding things. Yeah. Yeah,
and exactly. Like, you lived under Nazi-controlled Germany. There was people who were like, hey, we're not about this, and we're going to find a way to fight back and go against this. So I think this has been one of the more interesting conversations for me, because I think definitely coming into this, I was like, look, I love Lincoln. I think he did everything really well. I just can't get behind this being nice to the Confederate leaders after the war. And I think as we've kind of talked to this, I'm definitely seeing this in a much different light of what else was he supposed to do, and if unification is the goal, right?
I'm there with you, 100%. I think as just like maybe a closing thought, I was in a similar vein. I think that gut reaction has killed them, which is always kind of the gut reaction when it comes to things as personal and horrible as slavery, especially in this context. But when you get into the weeds, you start thinking about the decision-making process, what ultimately the goal was, and how to best accomplish it. This wasn't going to get fixed overnight. I think he did. Yeah, I don't want to say the right thing, because I don't think that's an apt choice of words. But I think I'll frame it this way. I think killing them or executing leadership of the Confederate Party would have probably been a bad decision.
Yes, I think that's a really good way of putting it. There may have been better options.
Sure.
We don't know what was laid in front of him at the time. And I think the piece that comes back to is, changing the hearts and minds of people would have been difficult and all that stuff. But again, this is a democracy.
Exactly.
You've just had a part of your country secede and lose their American citizenship and essentially be a foreign entity. How the heck do you win that legal battle? I don't know how you do it. And I think being the America's still a young country. They love their Constitution. They live and breathe by democracy first. You can't just have this dictator sort of mindset come in and be like, well, for this one time, I'm going to execute 1,000 people without having them go through a fair trial, which is right in our Constitution and right in our Bill of Rights. I think, he's kind of, his hands are tied there. He has to go through the legal system. And again, that's just what has to happen. So I would agree with you on that one. And I'm just, my head's just kind of all over the place on, like, changing my mind through a conversation, which I think is great, because that's the main reason we started doing this, was to
exactly.
Right.
It's not easy. It's not easy. It is not easy.
This will be a good one, I think, to come back to one day when we finally, maybe we spend some more time into other civil wars and see how things ended. And I'd be really curious to see if, did the hearts and minds of people ever change after a revolution
so much
like this?
Interesting analysis, right? I think historical analysis, historical interpretation. One thing I learned from studying history is that the status quo or the orthodoxy changes as new sources come to light, new analysis is done. We could have the same conversation a decade from now, and based on new resources, think, oh man, we were so wrong. Right. And I think that's kind of hopefully the beauty of these discussions and conversations, is to never be too stuck in your initial analysis and be open to additional factors and evidence that may come to light that we necessarily might not know about just yet.
Yeah, I think that's a great closing line on, why we do this and why history is so fun to study. So, yeah. So thanks, Ritchie, for this. I think this was a great conversation, and I think, again, I'm walking away from this learning something new and having a new perspective on things, and hoping the listeners feel the same way.
Yeah, as interesting as always. We'll catch everyone on our next episode. Thank you guys for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the History in Motion podcast. We appreciate your support, and if you're a fan of what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll see you next time.